On a Tuesday morning in March of 1973, a farmer named Henry Caldwell walked into a feed store in Platte County, Nebraska, and asked for something no one in that room had ever heard before. "Do you sell wildflower seeds?" The man behind the counter didn't answer right away. He just stared at him, like he was trying to decide whether he had heard the words correctly. In 18 years of running that store, he had sold wheat seed, corn, fertilizer by the ton, and pesticides strong enough to strip a field down to nothing but soil. But wildflowers? For decoration? He finally asked. Henry shook his head. For my fields. That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that every man in that room stopped what he was doing. 4 farmers stood nearby, their hands resting on metal cans lined up across the counter, labels stamped with warnings, skull and crossbones printed in red ink. They were buying pesticide. Everyone was, because in 1973, you didn't farm without chemicals. You sprayed early, you sprayed often, and if you didn't, you lost your crop. One of the men let out a short laugh. Not cruel, just confused. "Flowers?" he said. "You planning to decorate your wheat?" A second man joined in. "You putting on a show for the county fair, too?" A third shook his head. "You're growing bugs, not crops." The laughter spread. Not loud, but steady. The kind of laughter that doesn't try to hurt you, but still does. Henry didn't react. Didn't smile, didn't argue. "I'm planting them between the rows," he said. That made it worse. "You serious? Between your crops? You trying to feed the pests instead of killing them?" Henry stood there, calm, steady, like none of it surprised him, like he had already heard all of this before he ever walked through that door. "I'm not trying to kill them," he said. That line landed differently. The laughter didn't stop, but it slowed. Because now it wasn't just strange, it sounded dangerous. "You're not trying to kill pests?" one man asked. Henry shook his head. "I'm trying to control them." Silence, heavier now, uncomfortable. Because in that room, in that year, those two ideas meant the same thing. Control meant chemicals. Control meant killing. There was no other way. The man behind the counter scratched his jaw. "I don't stock wildflower seeds," he said. "This is a farm supply store." Henry didn't hesitate. He pulled out his wallet, set a $20 bill on the counter. "Order them," he said. "I'll be back next week." No explanation, no argument, no attempt to convince anyone in the room. He turned and walked toward the door. Boots hitting the wooden floor, slow, steady, unchanged. And just before he stepped outside, the whisper came, just loud enough to follow him. "The bug farmer." A few quiet laughs. Henry didn't stop, didn't turn around, didn't defend himself. He stepped out into the Nebraska sunlight, the door closing behind him, cutting off the laughter, but not the judgment. That name spread faster than anything he would ever plant. Through the feed store, through the coffee shop, through church on Sunday mornings. The bug farmer. The man who planted flowers instead of killing pests. For weeks, then months, then years, that's all anyone called him. And the strangest part? He never once tried to correct them. Because Henry Caldwell wasn't trying to win an argument. He was waiting to win something else. For the next 3 years, everyone in that county believed he was the stupidest farmer alive. Until the summer came, when the chemicals stopped working and the bugs stopped dying. The truth was, Henry Caldwell had not walked into that feed store on a whim. He had been thinking about bugs for 4 years. Not the way most farmers thought about them. Not as something to poison. Not as something to curse when the leaves curled or the heads came up light. He had been watching them. Really watching them. It started in the summer of 1969, a bad aphid year, the kind that made men pace their fields before sunrise and come home angry before breakfast. Henry had been doing the same thing everybody else was doing then, spraying, counting days, watching the bugs come back, spraying again. One morning, just after first light, he walked to the far edge of his wheat field near an old fence line he had meant to clear for years but never had. Wild growth had taken over that strip. Queen Anne's lace, yarrow, a few yellow flowers he didn't know by name. Nothing useful, or so he had always thought. But when he bent down to check the aphids on the wheat near that edge, something looked wrong, or rather, right. The aphids were there, but not like they were in the middle of the field, not in thick green clusters, not spreading across every stem. They were scattered, broken up, controlled. Henry knelt lower. That was when he saw the first ladybug, then another, then 5 more. Red shells moving deliberately over the stalks, stopping, feeding, moving again. He watched one for nearly a minute. Aphid, aphid, another. The thing was eating the problem. Henry looked across the rest of the field. In the sprayed section, there were almost no ladybugs at all. Plenty of dying insects, plenty of chemical smell, plenty of aphids still hanging on, but no predators, nothing hunting them, nothing keeping them in check. He stayed there far longer than he meant to, long enough for the sun to rise hot over the field and for the whole pattern to settle into his mind. The edge of the field near the flowers was not untouched by bugs. It was balanced, and the middle of the field, the clean, modern, well-managed middle, was not. That night, Henry drove into town and went to the library. He asked for books on insects. The librarian looked surprised. "What kind?" she asked. "All of them," Henry said, "especially the ones that eat other insects." The county library did not have much. A few old agriculture bulletins, a handbook from the university, a textbook on entomology that had probably not been checked out in a decade. But it was enough to start. And once he started, he did not stop. Over the next 4 winters, Henry read everything he could get his hands on. He read about ladybugs, about lacewings, about hoverflies, about tiny parasitic wasps so small most farmers would never notice them. He read about predator-prey cycles, about beneficial insects, about habitat, about nectar sources, about what happened when one part of a field fed life instead of trying to sterilize it. He read about California orchards using biological controls. He read about natural systems that had managed pests for millions of years before man ever mixed poison in a spray tank. And he read about something that stayed with him more than anything else. A phrase from a university paper. Pesticide treadmill. Henry copied it down by hand. He read the paragraph below it 3 times. Spray kills pests, but it also kills their predators. The pests come back faster. The predators come back slower. So the farmer sprays again, and again, and again, stronger each time, more often each time, until the field depends on chemical force just to remain where it started. It made immediate sense to him. Not because he was a scientist, because he was a farmer. He understood what happened when you solved a problem in a way that made you weaker the next season. He understood dependency. He understood being trapped by your own solution. By 1972, he was no longer asking whether flowers might help. He was asking which flowers, which bloom times, which species, how far beneficial insects traveled from shelter into crop rows, how often they needed nectar, how much habitat was enough. He filled legal pads with notes, field maps, bloom charts, distances, lists of names that meant nothing to anybody else in Platte County. Black-eyed Susan, yarrow, coneflower, wild bergamot. To everyone else, they were weeds or decoration. To Henry, they were infrastructure. That was why, in March of 1973, he walked into the feed store and asked for wildflower seeds, like a man asking for fencing wire or wheat seed. Because by then, the idea was no longer an idea. It was a plan, a real one. And plans do not care whether other people laugh. The laughter still followed him, of course, through town, through church, through planting season. Bug farmer, flower man, the one who'd lost his mind. Henry let all of it pass through him like wind through dry grass, because he knew something his neighbors did not. This was not about that year's crop. Not really. This was about building a system, and systems take time. So he planted the strips along fence lines, at field edges, and in long bands through his largest wheat field, spaced close enough that no part of the crop stood too far from shelter. From the road, it looked ridiculous. A wheat field interrupted by ribbons of color before a single flower had even bloomed. But to Henry, it looked like the beginning of something most men would not recognize until it was too late. And by the time the first flowers opened that summer, the county had already made up its mind about him. Henry Caldwell was the bug farmer, the fool who planted flowers instead of fighting, the man who had chosen beauty over yield, the man who had forgotten what farming was. What they did not know was that he had never understood farming more clearly in his life. The first year, nothing happened. At least, nothing anyone else could see. From the road, Henry Caldwell's fields looked worse than before. The wheat rows were no longer clean lines stretching to the horizon. They were broken, interrupted, uneven. Strips of bare soil, patches of green growth that didn't belong, and here and there, flowers that looked completely out of place. By early June, the comments had already started. You see Caldwell's place? Field's going wild. He's letting weeds take over. Won't be farming much longer at this rate. At the coffee shop, the tone was more direct. Bug farmers feeding them early this year, saving them a trip. Won't need to migrate, they'll just move in. laughter, easy, confident, certain. Henry heard all of it. He just didn't answer. Because the truth was, he wasn't looking at the field the way they were. They saw weeds. He saw timing. They saw disorder. He saw structure. They saw a mistake. He saw the early stage of something that wasn't finished yet. That June, the aphids came, just like every year. Small at first, barely noticeable, then spreading, multiplying, covering stems and leaves in thin green lines that thickened by the day. The county responded the only way it knew how. They sprayed. Early. Hard. Uniform. Fields across Platte County turned silent after the spray rigs passed through. No insects. No movement. No life. Just the smell of chemicals hanging in the air. Henry sprayed too. Once. Early in the cycle. Before the flowers had fully taken hold. Before anything had time to build. He wasn't stubborn. He wasn't trying to prove a point. He was buying time. Through July, the difference between his field and the others was small. Maybe 5%. Maybe less. The aphids were still there. The damage was still visible. At harvest, his yield came in just under the county average. Not enough to panic, but enough to confirm what everyone already believed. Flowers don't pay. Should have sprayed twice like the rest of us. Told you it wouldn't work. Henry didn't argue, didn't defend the results, because he already knew what that year was. It wasn't proof, it was groundwork. That winter, he walked his fields again. Snow on the ground, wind cutting across the open land. But he wasn't looking at wheat anymore. He was looking at what stayed. Where insects sheltered, even in the cold. The strips he had planted were still there, not blooming, not visible from a distance, but alive, protected, waiting. And under the surface, so were the things that mattered most. Eggs, larvae, predators that had survived the spray because they had somewhere to survive, somewhere the chemicals hadn't erased. Spring of 1974 came early, warm, wet, perfect conditions for everything that lived in those fields. The aphids came back faster than the year before, thicker, earlier, more aggressive. The county reacted immediately. Spray rigs moved before the damage even showed. Prevention, control, stay ahead of the cycle. That was the rule. Henry did something different. He waited. Not blindly, not casually. He walked his fields every morning before sunrise, checking stems, checking leaves, watching numbers rise, and watching something else rise with them. Ladybugs. Not dozens, hundreds, then thousands. Small at first, easy to miss, then everywhere. Moving along the wheat like a second system layered over the first. Hunting, feeding, multiplying. By mid-June, something strange began to happen. The aphids were still there, but they weren't spreading the same way. Clusters would form, then break apart. Numbers would rise, then stall, then drop. Not because of chemicals, because something was eating them. Henry knelt in the field one morning and watched it happen in real time. A single ladybug climbed a stalk, stopped at a cluster, fed, moved, fed again. Behind it, nothing remained. No chemical residue, no burnt leaves, just balance. That summer, while the county sprayed twice, then 3 times, Henry sprayed once. And then he stopped. Not because he didn't need control, because he already had it. At harvest, the numbers told a different story. His yield was slightly below average again, 4%, maybe 5%, but his chemical cost was less than a quarter of everyone else's. Where others had spent thousands, he had spent a few hundred. When the math settled, he came out ahead. Not dramatically, not enough to convince anyone, but enough to make a few men stop laughing. Still, most of them didn't change, because 1 year could be luck. 2 years could be coincidence. Nobody in Platte County was ready to believe that flowers could do what chemicals had always done. But the system Henry had planted was no longer fragile. It was building, strengthening, spreading into every part of his land, quietly, patiently, waiting. And by the time the 3rd summer came, it would no longer need defending, because the fields would speak for themselves. The 3rd year was when everything broke. Not just in Henry Caldwell's fields, in the entire county. The summer of 1975 came in early, hot, dry, and relentless. By the first week of June, the wheat was already under stress, and the aphids came with it. Not gradually this time, not in scattered pockets. They came all at once, heavy, thick, uncontrolled. By mid-June, every farmer in Platte County knew something was wrong. The numbers didn't make sense. Fields that had been sprayed early were already showing infestation. Fields that had been sprayed twice were getting worse. By the 3rd spray, nothing changed. The aphids didn't die, they didn't slow down, they kept feeding, kept spreading, like the chemicals weren't even there. Men who had farmed their entire lives, men who trusted the system, stood at the edges of their fields and watched it fail. 1 spray, 2 sprays, 3, stronger mixtures, higher doses, different combinations. Nothing worked. At the co-op, the conversations changed. The confidence was gone. What are you using? Same as always. Mine's not touching them. Neither is mine. The extension agent drove from farm to farm, clipboard in hand, face tighter each day. He had no answer. None that anyone wanted to hear. Finally, at an emergency meeting, he said it out loud. It's resistance. The room went silent. They've adapted, he said, to the chemicals, multiple ones. Someone stood up. So what do we use? The agent shook his head. There isn't anything new yet. Maybe next season. Next season. The words landed like a sentence, because by next season, most of those crops would already be gone. By early July, the damage was everywhere. Fields that should have been waist high barely reached the knee. Leaves yellowed early. Heads formed thin or not at all. Entire sections collapsed under the weight of feeding insects. From the road, you could see it. A dull, sick color spreading across the county. Except for one place. One field that didn't match the rest. It started with a single truck, then another, then three more. Men pulling up along a gravel road, parking quietly, not talking much, just looking at Henry Caldwell's land. From a distance, it made no sense. The same strips, the same flowers, rows everyone had laughed at for 3 years. But the wheat was different. It stood taller, straighter, full, alive, not untouched, but not failing. One man climbed out of his truck and walked to the fence. He stood there for a long time, then slowly stepped through. Something farmers don't usually do, not without asking. But this wasn't about courtesy anymore. It was about survival. He walked into the field, boots brushing through the wheat, eyes scanning the stalks. There were aphids, of course there were, but not like his field, not overwhelming, not unstoppable. Then he saw it, a flash of red, then another, then 10 more, ladybugs, everywhere, on stems, on leaves, moving, feeding, working. He crouched down, watched one climb toward a cluster. Pause, feed, move, feed again. The aphids disappeared one by one. He looked closer. There was more. Small larvae crawling along the leaves. Lacewings. Tiny wasps flickering between stalks. Things he had never paid attention to before. Never needed to, until now. Around him, the field wasn't empty. It was active, alive, working in a way no chemical ever could. A system, not perfect, not clean, but stable. By that afternoon, more farmers came, then more. Word spread faster than the bugs had. Caldwell's field is holding. Something's different. You need to see it. By evening, half the county had stood at that fence, and for the first time in 3 years, no one laughed. Not one. That night, just before sunset, a truck pulled into Henry's yard. Then another. Then 3 more. Men stepped out, slow, unsure, like they were walking into something they didn't fully understand. One of them knocked on the door. Henry opened it, still in his work clothes, dust on his boots. No surprise in his face, like he had been expecting this moment for 3 years. The man standing there took a breath. "I walked your field," he said. Henry nodded. "I saw what's happening out there." Another pause. Then the words came, quieter than anything Henry had heard from them before. "I need you to explain it." A longer pause. "I need you to tell me how to do it." Henry stepped aside. "Come in," he said. That was the moment when everything changed. They stayed on Henry Caldwell's porch until well after dark. Long after the sun had dropped behind the fields. Long after the heat of the day had finally let go of the air. No one was laughing now. No one was making jokes. They sat with notebooks, with questions, with something close to desperation. And Henry, he just explained. He didn't lecture, didn't correct them, didn't remind them what they had called him for the last 3 years. He just told them what he had seen, what he had tested, what he had learned slowly, season by season. He told them about the balance, about how pests multiply fast, but predators multiply steady, how one depends on chaos and the other depends on time. He told them why spraying worked and why it stopped working, how every time they wiped a field clean, they weren't solving the problem, they were resetting it in favor of the bugs they were trying to kill. He showed them his notes, pages filled with observations, dates, counts, bloom cycles, where insects appeared, when they disappeared, how long it took for them to return. He explained the flowers, not decoration, not random, each one chosen for a reason. Early bloom, mid-season bloom, late bloom, food for insects that needed to stay, not just pass through. He explained distance, why no part of his field stood too far from shelter, why predators had to live inside the system, not outside of it. He explained patience, the hardest part. You won't see it the first year, he said, maybe not the second, but if you keep killing everything, you'll never see it at all. The men listened, really listened, because for the first time, they had no other option. Over the next weeks, something quiet began to happen across Platte County. Not loudly, not officially, no announcements, no meetings, just small changes. One farmer planted a strip along his fence line. Another left a corner unsprayed. Another cut back on his second application, just to see. Careful, skeptical, but watching, always watching. The recovery didn't come fast. Some fields were already lost. Some farmers couldn't afford to wait another season. They sold, moved on, left farming behind. Because once something breaks, not everyone can rebuild it. But the ones who stayed, the ones who listened, began to see it, first in patches, then in patterns, then across entire fields. The return of something they hadn't noticed was gone. Life. Not just crops, systems, balance, control that didn't come from a tank, but from the field itself. By 1977, Platte County didn't look the same anymore. From the road, you could see it. Strips of color running through the wheat, edges left alive, fields no longer silent. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't uniform, but it worked, and it kept working. Henry Caldwell never called it anything. He didn't name it, didn't claim it, didn't try to turn it into something bigger than what it was. He just farmed, the same way he always had, only now other people were paying attention. A few years later, people from outside the county started showing up. University men, researchers, students with notebooks and cameras. They walked his fields, counted insects, measured things Henry had never thought to measure. They gave it names. Integrated pest management, biological control, systems agriculture. Words that sounded important, words that made it feel new, even though Henry had already been doing it for years. He didn't argue with them, didn't correct them, didn't tell them they were late, because he wasn't trying to be first. He was just trying to be right. Henry Caldwell died in 1994. Same land, same fields, still working, almost to the end. No statue, no plaque, no sign on the road telling people what he had done. But if you drive through Platte County today, you can still see it. In the edges of fields, in the strips of color running through the crops, in the quiet movement of insects doing work no machine can replace. That was his legacy. Not the flowers, not the yields, not even the method. It was something simpler and harder. He was willing to look wrong long enough for the truth to prove him right. They called him the bug farmer. It turned out he was the only one who understood what the bugs were really doing.